Maybe that sound was not there, but waking up at 5:30 in the morning to the shouts of men in blue tracksuits was probably worse than hearing that sound. More importantly, they had no choice. This was not a game. In the 1980s, South Korea was experiencing an economic boom. After the war in the 50s, when the Korean peninsula was divided into North and South, the government had recovered from its wounds and had achieved incredible growth, and they had no intention of losing that momentum. The whole country was in a state of excitement ahead of the 1986 Asian Games and the 1988 Seoul Olympics, and the government quickly began to promote the country's rebranding efforts. They wanted to show off their great prosperity by attracting tourists to the country. But behind the miracle of the Han River, behind the rapid growth of Korea, there was an incredibly bitter and dark reality. In April 1981, a letter arrived in the office of then Prime Minister Nam Dok-won, handwritten by former President Choo Do-han, who had seized power in a military coup the year before. The letter ordered the authorities to crack down on begging and take strict protective measures against vagrants. The government had developed a policy of cleansing the streets of South Korea in preparation for the Olympics in '86 and '88. Nothing would ever be the same again. Under this regulation, which allowed for the arbitrary detention of vagrants, welfare centers were set up, and buses labeled Vagrant Transport Vehicle began to appear in metropolitan areas such as Busan. The government was rounding up people like dogs from the streets. These welfare centers, most of which were private facilities, were subsidized by the government according to the number of people they cared for. In other words, for each person cared for in the center, the government would pay the private institution a kind of commission, and this was an incredible incentive for all the center owners to recruit more people. But it was not only the institution owners who benefited from this commission. The state's police themselves were getting paid per person for sending people to these centers to purify the streets, and the premiums they received started to exceed their salaries. It was said that the homeless, the disabled, especially orphaned children, and even those who were randomly asked for identification on the street and could not show it, were randomly taken away for the sake of this project, for the sake of the commissions. Dozens of these gathering centers were being opened by the state and private institutions subject to the commission. It was forbidden to refuse, but even if you refused, you were taken away. This is how such persecution began in Korea in the 80s, but among those dozens of centers, one of them would bring up the rumors of the true story of Squid Game today and pass on its story for generations. Han Ju-son was just one of the people taken there with his sister. It was a beautiful fall day in 1984. Han, then 8 or 9 years old, was enjoying a long-awaited trip to the city with his father and sister. But Han's father still had some work to do, and he had decided to drop them off in the safest place he could, in front of a police station, so that the children would not get in the way while he did this. While he took care of his business, which would only take minutes, his children would stay in the safest place in the city with the police officers, who were supposed to be the most trustworthy people in the city. But unfortunately, contrary to expectations, those police officers would tear the family apart. While they were waiting there, a bus stopped in front of the police station and the children were forced onto the bus. The police officer had already made a few gestures with the man who had picked them up. They had no idea where they were being taken. Their father had told them to wait there and they were crying and telling this to the man in the bus, but it was futile. They made a lot of noise saying and shouting, and the men in charge were very angry and cruel, as you know what happened next. The bus took them to the brother's house, a private facility. Han and his sister were getting out of here after 3.5 years of nightmare. They were picking people up and taking them away for ridiculous reasons, such as why you looked, why you walked sideways, why your eyes were this color, why your clothes were torn. As I said, both the police who took them off the street and the institution to which they were handed over were profiting from this, so to speak, and the masks of the show, so to speak, were the crew running this whole operation. And apart from that, of course, the families were contacting the police to look for their missing children. But you know the story. There was no point in asking the one who lost them to ask the one who lost them. Brothers' Home was one of the largest of these outreach centers and was located near a residential area in the southeastern port city of Busan. Park Yun-jin, the owner of this particular center, often insisted that it was set up to feed, clothe, and educate vagrants, to purify society. On paper, each of the people who came to these centers was supposed to be held for just 1 year, trained and released back into society. But the truth is that for many of them, the time to see their friends and family again would come in 1987, after more than 30 escaped prisoners had exposed what really happened behind the walls after the centers were closed. The government wanted to present the country at its best to the world and get the vagrants off the streets. But the House of Brothers had become less a place to house public nuisances or a warm home for the homeless, and more a place of the worst human rights abuses in the region. It was as if everything depended on getting orphans and orphans off the streets so that the country would appear to be a much more prosperous and safe place. In the future, these officials would say that people were being taken off the streets and imprisoned in the House of Brothers and Sisters. But that would be too little. Too late. The people who were taken to this house were people who were just trying to go about their daily lives, people who were living on the streets without harming anyone, or people who were just drinking, or even disabled people, orphans and orphan children. In the future, when 9 of the survivors speak to the press to share what it was like to be held in the camp, they will say that they were starved, exploited, and forced to work without pay in the camp's many production factories. At 5:30 a.m., you were awakened by the bells of the church you were obliged to attend and the donations of the guards. You had to memorize the hymns to be sung and recite them in full. During the service, you learned what would happen to you if you got itchy or if your eyes wandered left or right, not figuratively but physically. Each so-called guest, the prisoner, was given daily targets. You had to carry this many stones. You had to build this many meters of wall. And if you were sick or hurt or something happened, and somehow you didn't achieve that goal, your punishment was a baseball bat. Zhao Hinhu was on his way back from school when a police officer asked him to stop and started searching his bag. What could have come out of her bag but books and notebooks? He had half a sandwich left over from lunch. But that was a commission in the eyes of the policeman. He asked her where she had stolen the bread. Of course, she repeatedly told him she hadn't stolen it, but he wouldn't listen. Finally, when he heard that if he confessed he would let him go, he said, "Yes, I stole it." But this confession was his ticket to the brothers' house. People were being treated with cold water, and very, very bad things were being done that I cannot tell you about. I think you can imagine. The show was a story, there was no choice. There was no motivation for effort. Nothing compared to what happened here. Those who tried to escape were denounced by their fellow inmates who were kept there, hoping that maybe they could curry favor with the people in charge and be beaten less. Because if someone managed to escape, the head inmate of that dormitory or all the rest would be punished. People in blue tracksuits, plastic shoes, numbers written on them, and nylon underwear were brought here without knowing how long they would stay. The dormitories were filled with bunk beds, 4 to a bed, and the menu of the day was usually stinky fish and barley rice. When you went to bed at night, it was imperative to watch your back, which, as I said, I can't explain it, but I'm describing it indirectly, was not only your life but also your honor. Evidence from the field suggests that people were used as slaves in construction sites, farms and factories throughout the 80s. Another prisoner, Park Sun-hee, managed to escape from the facility in 1986 at the age of 17, but gave birth only a few months later. The reason for this birth was also obvious, although I cannot say it again. And the reason for her escape was that the authorities at the brothers' home were selling the children there for adoption abroad with forged documents. So she disregarded her own life and ran away so that her child would not be sold. All the other sold children had parents out there looking for them, but the numbers were horrible. Just in 1985 and 1986, the South Korean government gave a financial support of $10 million to the operator of the brothers' house for the people he collected in a 2-year period. so you can imagine how many people were recruited. But the investigations in 1987 revealed that only 10% of the detainees were vagrants or real criminals. All those who did not have a permanent residence, or were beggars, were forced to live in such centres. Prisoners were forced to work in a total of 20 different factories in the field, in sectors such as wood and metalworking, clothing, footwear and fishing. At the same time, many workers had to build new buildings in Busan and Ulsan. The factory products were exported to Japan and Europe, which was another source of income for the owner of the brothers' house. The children also had to work, and they worked in the production of fishing line and needles that went to Japan. If you made a mistake or the quality of the product was not good enough, you ended up with baseball bats and clubs. According to official figures, which are not very reliable, there were 3,128 inmates in the House of Brothers in 1986, and almost a fifth of them died because of the conditions. Of course, estimates suggest that the actual numbers were much higher, but the passing years and the poor conditions did not change the situation until 1987, when the police made a surprise raid and uncovered the victimization. Of course, as a result of the revelations, the facility was directly locked down, but after the closure of the facility, its owner Park was arrested and unfortunately sentenced to 2.5 years in prison for embezzling state funds. Although he would die of natural causes in 2016, he would spend the rest of his time on the outside. Investigators found $5 million in his office, both in state funds and from the export of products of forced labor. But literally no one was held accountable for the human rights abuses at the brothers' house. Even today, there are those who were involved and continue to be in politics. And of course, the government has refused subsequent requests for investigations and even fought against claims and investigations into what happened there. No government agency has ever issued an apologetic statement on the matter. And because Korea did not want negative publicity in the run-up to the Olympic Games, for which thousands of people were persecuted, in 1987, the issue was little publicized and has been covered up to this day. Furt Han Chu-song, who managed to get out of there and made his voice heard with the drawings you see in the story, and his actions alone in front of government buildings. He made sure that the closed case was reopened and put on the agenda. She may not have been able to make her voice heard for years, but she had somehow shown herself by traveling across the country. On that day, when she was taken away from the police station with her sister, she thought that something would be the end, but perhaps thanks to her luck, she was able to get out of there and voice the persecution she had experienced years later. In a lawsuit brought against the state by 15 victims of the brothers' home case, the court ruled that the state should pay a total of 4.6 billion won in compensation. The figure was significant. As a result of Khan's actions, the court finally declared that the government, while praising the welfare state as envisaged in the constitution, has classified the socially disadvantaged, those suffering from poverty or ill health, as vagrants, and has excluded them from society under the pretext of harsh intervention. So this story is not the true story of the Squid Game, but it is clearly more horrifying than the Squid Game in its subject matter.